we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
Fact checkers, the following comes directly from the 26-page Uluru Statement from the Heart and the 86 pages from the 12 dialogues held to create the statement, delivered only after a Freedom of Information request. You can check this for yourselves. I've read all 112 pages several times now.
They know the Uluru Statement from the Heart is one page.
Do you agree with most of what is said in those 25 pages?
I haven't read it.
You haven't read it?
There's 120 pages. Why would I?
The Voice is part of the Uluru Statement. The statement calls and wants for a black-only parliament, a black-only political party, a black constitution, an Aboriginal constitution, the creation of new states and territories, a pan-Aboriginal state, state powers, lots of designated seats in government, an elected assembly with its own constitution, a defined territory made up of Aboriginal-owned or native title lands, which could lead to, quote, representation at the United Nations.
And I tell you what, we are sick of governments not listening to our voice. We are going to use the rule book of the nation to force them.
There is nothing more powerful than building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with.
The people who stand with me on this stage, I regard as giants.
Thomas Mayo.
Thomas Mayo written a handbook called the Voice to Parliament Handbook. All the detail you need.
Thomas Mayo is a signatory to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but was also entrusted with the physical document.
Mayo is part of the referendum working group.
He spent 18 months travelling around Australia to garner support for an Indigenous voice to Parliament.
Hi Australia, my name is Tila Reid. I was part of the constitutional dialogue process.
Tila has been there in the heart of creating a framework for rethinking our constitution.
Referendum engagement group member Tila Reid.
You have all these remarkable people like Thomas Mayo and Tila Reid.
We have to understand this concept of the voice is the first step in redistributing power.
And the Makarrata Commission would have two jobs. First, the national process of truth-telling.
Truth is truth-telling. Truth-telling is needed to achieve reparations to resolve unfinished business. That's with a capital U and a capital B. Unfinished business is anything bad that happened since Captain Cook set foot in Botany Bay, end quote, and comes from quotes such as this: I want to see us continue the decolonisation of Australia, end quote.
The voice is the first step in redistributing power.
There's this notion of reconciliation. It's not enough.
Acknowledging Aboriginal people were here first is not wanted. However, acknowledging that the British were not colonisers but they were invaders, murderers and rapists, end quote, is part of truth-telling and allows for the last 250 years to be deemed illegal. Constitutional acknowledgement of this truth enables the legality of colonisation and therefore the later creation of Australia to be challenged through a class action from First Nations, as specified in the dialogues.
This is a modest request.
What we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
Keep going until we change the system, until we tear down the institutions that harm our people.
And also to pay respects to the elders of the Communist Party, who I think, without a doubt, have played a very important role in our activism.
There is $5.8 million set aside for the establishment of a Makarrata Commission, and the Makarrata Commission would have two jobs. First, the national process of truth-telling, and a national agreement making, which is really code for treaty.
Treaty is Makarrata. Makarrata is another word for treaty or agreement making that comes from the package of self-determination and is the, quote, culmination of their agenda, end quote. Self-determination is a guiding principle from the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and means that, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to enforcement of treaties, agreements and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, end quote. Self-determination involves gaining political and economic power and especially rights to lands, territories and resources through treaties, after, quote, substantial constitutional change and structural reform, end quote.
You know, this is the first step. It's a vital step. Pay the rent, for example. You know, how do we do that in a way that is transparent and that it actually sees reparations and compensation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
The voice isn't ready. We begin to demolish the system that continue to oppress us.
All these remarkable people.
After a treaty negotiating framework is enshrined in the Constitution, a Makarrata Commission will supervise truth-telling and all subsequent treaties. Treaty commissions and a council will be set up with the idea being that, quote, the body could help with the fight, pushing for whatever we want to get, end quote.
We own this land to the exclusivity of all others, which comes under federal native title. You might not like it, but guess what? Times are changing. You don't own the land, we do. Get off it, please. Off our land. Off our land. Your mother came. Off our land.
There will be treaties among Aboriginal tribes, nations to set boundaries, treaties with local, state and federal governments, and then a treaty with every single First Nation down the track, meaning hundreds of, quote, substantive nation-by-nation agreements with First Nations and governments, end quote.
Off my land. Nanyambana, Shua, Jaudamangabanya.
Native title exclusive rights, not non-exclusive, exclusive. We might put up a great big fence and cut all of your views. Keep going. We're doing it right now.
Everything will be funded by reparations. Treaty reparations include land and sea rights, water rights, subsurface rights, airspace and allodial titles, a percentage of GDP, rates, land tax, royalties and tariffs, or other forms of monies levied from people for, quote, going on to country, end quote.
Yeah, we got teeth last year.
Big open Jaudamangabanya.
Yeah, you laugh or you like, go Google some shit and educate yourselves. Exclusive native title right to the exclusivity of all others.
Treaties will not cancel out existing agreements and benefits already in place. The idea is that the many annual billions spent on Aboriginal affairs will continue but be controlled by Aboriginal people only. And multinational corporations and perhaps corporations will have to pay the rent. Non-Aboriginal Australians take responsibility for truth-telling history, i.e. through reparations. Reparations are for past criminal acts, but also, quote, compensation for present and future criminal acts, end quote.
Does need to be these tough decisions and reparations for what First Nations peoples have lost.
This all equates to sovereignty. Sovereignty also comes from laws. Jurisdictions on First Nation law will be recognised to, quote, create far-reaching structural reform, end quote.
The power in the voice is that it creates the ability for First Nations to go forth with coherent positions on what legislation needs to be created, what legislation needs to be amended, and punish politicians that ignore our advice.
As it states, there are, quote, 260 existing unwritten Aboriginal constitutions, end quote. These would be acknowledged and they come with unique, quote, rules, policies and procedures of governance, end quote. A prohibition on racial discrimination means veto power on laws seen as detrimental to Aboriginal people, with the word race being replaced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as this law, quote, should be only for First Peoples, end quote. Another relevant quote, we are not part of multiculturalism, we are the First Nations. A First Nations Parliament will draft legislation, hand this to the Australian Parliament, and Aboriginal lawyers can influence High Court decision-making on cases involving Aboriginal issues. We are reminded in the document that the High Court recognised land rights back in 1992. So there's a fair bit of power in influencing the High Court judges.
There is nothing more powerful than building a First Nations voice, a black institution, a black political force to be reckoned with.
International human rights lawyers and agencies can assist when deemed necessary. Quote, there is a potential for the two sovereignties to coexist in which both Western and Indigenous values and identities are protected and given voice in policies and law, end quote. So the Australian system and the Aboriginal system will each have a voice.
It's going to be very difficult once we succeed for a government to ignore this voice. It will be powerful.
There is considered talk about changing the Australian flag, statue removal, Australia Day becoming the annual day of mourning, cultural sensitivity training for non-Aboriginal Australians, truth-telling and learning about the resistance fighters may become compulsory in education, and young Aboriginal people need all of the above reparations to become, quote, the future activists and warriors, end quote.
What we need is to get back to these radical roots of the Communist Party.
All of the above are changes to fix the day-to-day lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Share this video to people who don't have time to read through the 112 pages. If you want to read through the pages, please go to truearrowevents.com. Hope that helped. Thanks for watching.
There is an assumption out there that all Indigenous people want the voice. This is not true. Everybody that wants to, with the good intentions, want to make things better. But we are not all the same, and there's a lot of us Aboriginal people that are voting no.